Hello and welcome to the East West Quantum Leap Symphonic Orchestra Orchestration for Metal Tutorial Part 3, where I'm going to be talking about the different inserts I use for mixing and final mastering stages. Now, there are two ways you can generally go about mixing an orchestra for use in metal. You can choose to either create your orchestral tracks separately as if you were just writing an orchestral piece, mix that down, and then use that as a stereo file within a metal song. Or you can insert individual instrument lines for each of the instruments within the metal song and treat them like you would the guitars or the vocals or whatever, and mix them all in individually. I know a lot of professionals. Two examples that come to mind are Fredrik Nordstrom, who does a lot of Dimmu Borgir stuff. If you're not familiar with them, the black metal, they use a lot of orchestras. They've used a mix of VST orchestras and real orchestras in their stuff. On some of the albums he's made for them, preferred using just a stereo mix down of the orchestra, as did Bob Rock, who did the S&M video for Metallica. In my opinion, that's one of the best mixes of real orchestra with metal. It's extremely well produced, especially for a live recording. And so in both those cases, they have just taken down a stereo mix of the orchestra and added it to the music. Now, what I find that tends to do, obviously I've not done that with a real orchestra, but if I mix that down to a stereo track and use that in a metal song, the orchestra sounds a lot more realistic than it does adding the individual instruments in. But at the same time, you're losing quite a lot of control over the volume of individual instruments and maybe tweaking some EQs here and there. You can obviously go back to your original mix and change it, but that's obviously quite time consuming if you get halfway through your main mix of your metal song and realize the violins are slightly too loud just for a period of a couple of seconds, and you've then got to go back into your orchestra mix and redo all of that side of things. It's far easier in those cases where you've just got a violin line in your mix for your metal song that you can then just automate and the job is done. So you're trading off realism for, I suppose, a bit of convenience, but also looking at it realistically. When you insert individual instrument tracks into your metal track, you have a lot more flexibility to maybe cut some low end or tweak some high end or whatever, or compress it a bit more. I personally get better results doing that. So it's not quite as realistic, but I think the whole metal song works better because of that. So really, that's personal choice what you prefer. So let's get on and have a look at the way I approach these two different ways of doing things. So hopefully give you some ideas for the way you can solve your own problems with it. Now, whichever method you choose to go with, at the end of the day, with this side of things, less is definitely more. One thing I've found is that when you do low cuts on something like violins or stringed instruments, it's a far more pronounced effect than doing a low cut on a guitar or a vocal or something. And it's extremely easy to cut things, not too much each, but by the time you've cut everything across the board, it can sound really thin and nasty. So I've definitely found that you have to be a lot more subtle with the way you apply your effects. Okay, first of all, covering mixing a whole orchestral song. This song we've got in front of us here, as you can see, got quite a good array of instruments. I've got a lot of percussion. I've got the full string range, double bass, cello, viola, violin. I've then got some woodwinds, clarinet, flute, oboe, and I've got a harp in there as well. So this was my song Road to Imladris. I'll put a link up on screen if anyone's interested in listening to the final product. The most varied mix that I've got to use as an example for you, and hopefully includes a lot of the instruments that you would use as well. I'll bring over my mixer now to show you what I've done to all of these instruments. Now we'll start with percussion. The percussion I've got on the left here, you can see all I had was timpanis, snare, some cymbals, and then this red percussion is the group. Not a great deal going on. One other consideration I had with all of these MIDI channels, I had 3 versions of play running as well to cover the different instruments, and that was getting pretty heavy on the CPU load. So I also had to consider how many plugins I was using. I didn't really want to bounce down individual sections and mix them separately. I've not had great results doing that in the past. You may want to do that yourself, but because with the percussion you can go a bit further with the way you process things. It's more like a rock or metal drums in that sense. You can do a lot more to it and it still sound natural. I wanted to EQ and compress, and so I used the C4 to sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone and not use too much processing power on each one. And the timpanis I just treated like toms basically, and I used one of their presets, the Gershwin Thumper #2, which I think is one of his presets for a kick drum actually, but it worked very well in this case, and it took out a lot of the mid that the lower strings and brass might take up. Well, I don't actually have any brass in this one, sorry, the lower woodwinds. The snare, using another Gershwin one for clarity, I think he did this for the snare to give a nice crack between 1 and 4, taking out some of the lower body there. That was necessary. I know sometimes with a metal snare you want to add a bit of low mid body to give it some power, but wasn't really required with the orchestra, so utilizing both the C4 as well and the EQ element of this to keep everything reined in where I want it. Cymbals didn't need the compression themselves, but that's fairly straightforward, a fairly normal sort of thing to do. A complete low cut from 1 to 8 or so, take out a lot of the low mids and just raise the real high end to let that sheen come through. And then when I put it all through percussion, it was still overbearing on everything else, so I actually had to just pull everything down when it got too much, especially at the low end still. So that's actually quite extreme to put the multiband compressor on each one and then also on the bus for it as well, but it's what I found worked, and the percussion definitely wasn't the most important thing in this orchestral mix. And certainly if you're having percussion for your orchestra mixing with your metal drum kit as well, you're going to want to keep the percussion, I suppose, pretty much in the background. I mean, obviously certain situations will dictate otherwise, but this is a good way of reining it in if you need to. Moving on to the instruments, if I just scroll across here, what you'll notice, if we start here, this is the contrabass. If you're not familiar with Cubase, these blue ones are my inserts. The Q10 is just a 10-point EQ. It's very, very good. It's quite transparent. And what you'll notice is if I scroll along, pretty much all I've done is put a Q10 on every single track. And that's it. There's then a room ambience I'll come on to in a bit, but you can see that's the only thing I've really done except for on this contrabass, where EQ I've just rolled off the end. Now remember I said if you roll off too much it really becomes thin with an orchestra, so I only started rolling off at around 30 or so. You don't want to pull that back too much because it will really destroy the sound. I gave it a little boost. What I've done, as I say, I'll go along and show you what I've done with each one very quickly, but I'm not going to describe each one because that's just going to be boring and take too long. But what you will notice is a very similar pattern where I've looked at the instrument. Double bass is obviously a bassier one, so raise the bass a little bit. I've taken out a couple of bits where there was some woolliness, and I've just added a bit of high end just to help it cut through slightly, but obviously you want the high end is really reserved for everything else. And you'll see every instrument follows exactly the same procedure. I've analysed the low end and decided whether it needs a bit of a boost or a cut. I've found a couple of areas where some of the nastier or woollier frequencies need to be removed, and I've also found a high end area that's the good character of the instrument and either raised or lowered that as required as well. So double bass, cellos. As we get to the higher instruments though, you can raise the point at which you start cutting off. Now the viola and violins you'll see are a bit higher, but still that's not too high in comparison to what you might do with some metal stuff that's that high, especially something like a lead guitar. I might cut off at about 150, but here we're only going at about 80 or so. Then we're on to the woodwinds. We've got a clarinet here. I was able to again pull that up a bit more. The strings are now filling out the low end. Flute, again that's the highest instrument I've got here, so that's got, I think, the highest, but even still I found I couldn't cut it off too sharply because it did destroy the body. Oboe, that needed to cut through over the clarinet and the flute, so I really sort of cut out the lower parts of that to let that shine through on the top end. And the harp is quite a woolly instrument, and it was used sparingly. Needed a bit of high end to shine through, but also I didn't want that woolliness to cloud all the strings, so that's why that had quite a steep cut off there. One other thing I found is it's quite hard to use too much reverb with a full orchestra because of the way orchestras normally work. You think of the places you would listen to an orchestra, it tends to be either big places like the Albert Hall or something that will have a lot of big room reflections, or you'll have something quite a lot smaller like a church or a cathedral, which will have a lot of stone surfaces where there's a lot of reflections, and although it's a smaller space, you still get that sort of big reverby sound because of all the reflections coming off the hard walls and all the angles. But I'd found that even with the play reverbs on each track, I still needed to send everything to an auxiliary room sound that I called it. You'll see I had it very low, minus 26 dB there, so it's just poking through to pull everything together and add a bit more space. What I did first though with my low band was, you see I made a complete brick wall cutoff at about there's 86 on that frequency there. Then I kept the low end really low on the reverb. I really just wanted the high end to come through to help tie things together. This EQ, by the way, if it's confusing you, is the Line EQ low band by Waves. It only deals with things up to 2K, so you can have a lot more detail with what you're doing at your low end, just in case you thought this was a full scale. It isn't, it only goes up to 2K there. So pulled out all of the low end and then had a nice 2.5 second tail on a good reverb. This IR reverb from Waves is probably their most realistic, I think. I'm not a massive fan of their R-verb or true verb. I do use it in certain situations, but you can't beat this IR for making the best realistic room sounds that they do. When it comes to the final mix, this is my mix bus, this stereo out here. I used an SSL bus compressor. Any bus compressor will do. Again, the rule is very sparing, so I only had it on a 2:1. I then put it through the Lion MB multiband compressor to take out a bit of woolliness. If you need my tutorial on this, I'll put a link in the description. And many of you will understand, if you've used it in the way that I've shown you to use it, you'll know why I've put it on here. One point though on the range is what really decides what ratio this will compress at. And my understanding from reading the manual is a minus 9 dB is around a 2:1. I think minus 11 is about a 1.5. So there's not a great deal of compression going on there, only about 1.5 dB. So there's a good range there. It's just adding a tiny bit of flavor there and cutting out a tiny bit of the string woolliness. I then just had a standard limiter on there at -1 just to stop anything clipping, and that was it. This is just an analyzer just so I could see what the waveform is doing. So after that, there's not any further mastering I do, no maximizing, because I find that ruins the life of it. And here you can see this is my final mixed track. Now you'll see that is a lot more dynamic than a final track you would see from a metal mix, and I really would advise this is not one that I added to a metal song. This is one I kept just as an orchestral piece. Certainly if you're putting it in a metal song as well, you'd want these dynamics to add flavor on top of the metal song. You wouldn't want to be maximizing this up as loud as possible, because it really you'd struggle then to get that in the mix better. So also with an orchestra it sounds a lot more natural. If you look at anything that's released commercially for a proper orchestra, it will look more like this than like a fully maximized metal song. So that's it for mixing a full orchestra. I'll now open one of my metal projects where I'm using individual orchestral tracks within the metal song to show you how things might differ there. Okay, and here now we have a full metal mix where I've got the usual guitar tracks, bass track, normal metal drums. Then on the orchestra side I've got a full string section, contrabass, cello, viola, violin. I've then got another string pad, I'll explain that shortly. I've got some brass this time around, tuba, trombone, French horn and trumpet. There's a choir, we can ignore that because that's treated like a voice, so forget about that in terms of orchestral arrangements. A gong, I mean there isn't really any other percussion in this, I just use the metal drum kit. So the gong again you just treat as a cymbal. So how would I go about treating this differently to the full stereo orchestra mix? Well, the answer to that is unfortunately it depends. The main thing to think about with metal is that the vocals will clash a lot with strings and with the general orchestra sound. They both like to vie for the same EQ space. So something like this introduction that I've got here, where there are no vocals, I can be a lot more lenient with what I do with the mixing of the orchestra side of things. The strings I've EQ'd in a similar way to how I'd done earlier in the video for the other mix. With brass, brass is an interesting one with metal. It cuts through electric guitars and vocals very well. So if you think about anything by Dimmu Borgir or Nightwish, or any symphonic metal band you could care to mention, the brass cuts through very easily. It's very prominent in a mix, and that's just because of the nature of the waves. I think brass is made with a sawtooth wave in general, and strings tend to produce more of a sine type wave. And the sawtooth wave is very bright and it just cuts through on its own. So all I've done is grouped them all through one brass group here. I've left them all clean. I haven't touched the individual tracks, and then I've just rolled off some of the low ends so that the tuba doesn't clash with the contrabass too much. That's really all that needs to happen. Now, one note with the strings, it can pay to have different sounds for different things. Here, when my guitars kick in properly, one thing I should mention as well is in the introduction, when I've got the orchestra playing, the guitars aren't at their full volume. I've got them at about 80% volume. The orchestra sort of ends at about bar 20 here, but I keep a string pad going along. Now that string pad, if I bring up the string group here and play, you can see it's got nothing virtually below 500, so it's not messing with the lower guitars and it's not messing with the drums at all really. That is a really clear sound, and I wouldn't have that with the full-on sounds that I have with the full string section. This is just string section sound, which isn't as realistic as the individual strings, but it's more relevant to what I needed for that part of the song. So do be prepared to mix and match things. Don't feel you have to stick with one particular sound through the song. Once the guitars are over the top, it's harder for people to notice that there's been any change in the character of the sound, but it makes your mixing job a lot easier. One other thing that I want to cover is I've put all of these orchestra sounds through one orchestra group, and there's a few things I've done to this which you need to know about. I'll come on to Studio EQ in a minute, but this is an effect that if you've got waves you really need to be using for an orchestra. I wouldn't advise using this if you've just mixed an orchestra on its own like I had earlier on, but if you're using an orchestra within a mix, this is a wonderful tool. What it does is it's like a stereo imager, and it spreads the different frequencies across the spectrum in such a way that just really cleans it up so nicely to fit into a mix nicely. I can't really explain it. It's one of those plugins that just works really well at the job it's meant to do. If we're going to load, what I'd used is the Mono Remaster for an orchestra. What that's been designed to do is take the different frequencies that are characteristic for different orchestra instruments and move them a bit further out in the stereo field, and it works really, really well at cleaning things up and getting rid of some of that muddiness or woolliness that an orchestra can suffer from when it's put in with the metal guitars in particular. So I turned that on, and what they recommend, the manual says that you should put something like the True Verb after it. True Verb I find to be very synthetic. I don't really like it as a reverb, but obviously Waves know what they're talking about, and by putting this one on after the PS22, it works extremely well at rounding off that sound. You'll notice I have it very low. I used the medium concert setting. If I show you what that is, that's the medium concert default setting. All of their direct early reflections and reverb are up on full, where on my one I've turned the early reflections off completely and I've brought the reverb down to -4. Also up here, the room size I brought down quite a lot, and I've also rolled off the low end as well, which wasn't done in the default setting. So that's slight customization, but again, you would do that to taste. And by turning both of them on, what I would do is play the beginning of this for you and turn those effects on and off so you can see what sort of effect this has on the sound. Okay, hopefully it's just quite subtle, but hopefully you did hear that it does sort of take away some of the low mids from the middle of the stereo field and move them out a bit without making it sound woolly on the outsides. It sort of frees up the middle for the bass and the drums in a really nice way. So I highly recommend, if you've got that, then you should try using it if you can. If you don't have it, maybe a normal stereo widener will help you in that regard, or maybe using some mid-side EQing. I will be doing a tutorial on that at a later date, but I'm afraid this is one of those instances where a commercial product does work really well for the job, so I do use it. One final thing I did mention: when vocals come in and they clash with everything, what I do to get round that is I put an EQ in at the beginning of my chain on the final orchestra bus, and I automate it to turn on when the vocals cut in, just so any orchestra that's playing at the same time, you'll see, gets quite a bit of a cut from 200 downwards. I mean, really that affects from 500 downwards. As you can see, there's a big dip around 2K. That's the sort of one of the main areas for the vocals, and there's a slight rise at the top to compensate and help the sound still cut through a bit. So that is automated to turn on when the vocals come on, and you can turn it off again when the vocals go away again. It's one of those things that's worth doing to balance your mix and get things fitting in together really well. So that's the way I EQ my orchestras within a metal song. If you want to hear that full song, it's called The Unknown Constant. It's in my Dark Matter playlist. I'll put a link in the description as always, and hopefully that's given you some ideas to work with yourselves, and I'll see you for another tutorial soon. Cheers.